I'm going to show you some watercolor techniques. So make sure you have a tray of watercolors, a cup of water, a paper towel, and then a couple of other supplies depending on what you're going to do. The first one's called dry brush. So with dry brush, my brush is barely wet, and I picked up my paint, and I'm just going to paint with it. With very little water on my brush. Wet on dry is, I'm going to have a little bit more water on my brush when I paint. So I'm going to stick with green just so you can see what the difference is. It flows a lot better when you do a wetter paintbrush. Wet on wet is where you start with a wet piece of paper. So I'm just putting some clean water on it with a clean paintbrush. And then I'm going to take my paint and watch what happens when I put it on here. Oh, let's get a little bit more. It kind of runs a little bit and fills in where all those water spots are. Lifting is where I'm painting. And then I take a clean, dry paintbrush. Let me dry this off for you. And I start to pull up sections of paint. I'm wiping off my paintbrush each time. It might be hard to tell, but it's removing some of it and leaving a little bit of a texture. Dots. Let me switch to my smaller paintbrush for here. Dots is exactly what it sounds like. I'm going to use my paintbrush, and I'm going to use just the tiny point of it, and I'm going to start doing dots. Notice how I'm not jamming my paintbrush into my paper. The paint is only staying on the tip. Okay, salt is a fun one. And that is where you, let me switch colors. Start with your paint. It has to be a pretty wet paint and you don't want it to dry. You're going to take a tiny bit of salt, put it on, and it leaves a really cool effect. Wait till it dries before you remove it. A wash is where you make it a smooth transition, a flat color. So your brush is pretty wet for this one. Do orange. You can also make it fade as well. So smooth transition. Plastic wrap is kind of similar to the salt idea, where you start off with a very wet paintbrush and you paint with it. And then you take some plastic wrap like this. You lay it over top. And when you pull it up, you get a neat little effect where it kind of makes it pool together. Oil pastel technique is where you draw a picture with oil pastel. It could be anything you want. You paint over top of it. And because you're using water against oil, the water doesn't stick to where the oil was, which is the same idea as a wax resist. Now, wax resist is kind of like a ghost painting where you draw it in a white crayon, for instance. You can't see what I just did, but when I put my paint over top of it, I'll also stick with blue so you can see the difference. Oh, pretty cool when that happens. It doesn't stick to it. Now you might notice that I have a little bit too much and it's not always showing, so you can kind of dab it a little bit too, which is similar to the plastic wrap technique.